Russia, the largest country in the world in terms of land mass, faces an economic imbalance that doesn't align with its vast territory. The majority of its GDP is concentrated in the western region, forming a circle on the map. This concentration has long been a challenge for Russian leaders, and it has become a significant concern for Putin amid his invasion of Ukraine. Some foresee another disintegration of the Russian state, as evident from recent news of rising Russian separatists taking control of towns near the Russian-Ukrainian border, such as Belgarad. This situation raises questions about whether this could mark the beginning of the end for Russia. History serves as a reminder that even during seemingly stable periods like the 1980s, before the Soviet Union's collapse, or the 1910s before the fall of the Russian empires, instability can arise. As we explore the potential scenario of a 21st century Russian collapse, there are concerns about how global and regional powers like the US and China would seize the opportunity to strengthen their positions. Critics argue that Putin is repeating the mistakes of past Russian leaders, which may lead the country down a path of disintegration. To understand Russia's current national interests, we must reflect on its history, which dates back to the small empire of Moscow. The Mongol invasion in the 1200s exposed the vulnerability of Moscow, lacking natural defenses like oceans or mountains. Ivan the Great's efforts to expand and create a buffer zone demonstrated the importance of safeguarding Moscow from external threats. The Romanov dynasty continued this expansion for 3 centuries, turning Russia into a vast empire, even extending its influence to Alaska until it sailed to the United States in 1865. Russia's involvement in World War I marked the end of its participation in wars under the Tsar's rule. Prior to this conflict, Russia suffered significant losses and faced internal unrest, leading to the 1905 Russian Revolution. As tensions rise with the invasion of Ukraine, the nation treads on a delicate path, where stability may be deceptive, and historical lessons might offer valuable insights. Be sure to support this video by hitting the like button. Your continued support is greatly appreciated. I must emphasize that, putting humor aside, Russia was in no position to engage in a war economically or militarily. Unfortunately, entering World War I only exacerbated the hardships for the Russians at home. The casualties suffered by Russia surpassed those of any other nation in previous wars. The country faced severe food and fuel shortages, with inflation mounting. The costly war effort further disrupted an already weak economy, exacerbated by rampant government corruption. Nicholas repeatedly dissolved the Duma when it opposed his wishes. In 1917, a revolution broke out in Petrograd, known today as St. Petersburg, where protesters clashed with police and refused to back down. The protests grew so significant that the Duma seized the opportunity to establish a provisional government and remove the Tsar from power. Despite ongoing food supply problems, the new government continued Russia's war efforts in World War I, intensifying the unrest in the country. Later that year, the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, took advantage of the situation and overthrew the provisional government. This marked the official rise of the Russian Communist Party, as Russia's thirst for expansion and the inability to control such a vast territory led to its eventual downfall, a recurring theme in modern Russian history. Throughout this tumultuous period, Russia lost a considerable amount of territory, including significant regions like Poland, which had been partitioned between Russia, Prussia, and Austria-Hungary in the late 18th century. Poland declared independence in 1918 and fought against Soviet Russia, resulting in the Treaty of Riga in 1921, recognizing Polish independence and establishing new borders. Similarly, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania also declared independence in 1918 and fought wars against Soviet Russia, achieving recognition of their independence through treaties that established new borders. Moreover, Romania gained significant territories from Russia as a result of the Treaty of Bucharest in 1918, including parts of Bessarabia, Bukovina, and Transylvania. These territorial losses dealt a severe blow to Russia's prestige and power, prompting new leadership to take control. The loss of these territories had far-reaching economic consequences for Russia, as they were rich in natural resources, including timber, minerals, and agricultural land. Losing access to these resources impacted the struggling Russian economy post-World War I and the Russian Revolution. Additionally, the loss of these territories affected Russia's economic and trade relations with other countries. as the newly independent states pursued their own trade policies, different from Russia's, hindering its access to markets and goods. Furthermore, losing these territories weakened Russia's ability to project power and influence in the region, making the country more vulnerable to external threats and challenges, thus affecting its economic stability and growth. The loss of these territories also had a profound impact on the Russian national identity, as it was closely tied to the idea of a powerful and expansive empire, leading to a sense of loss and disillusionment among many Russians. The loss of territory had a profound impact on the Russian economy and society, which was enduringly felt. This economic hardship provided an opportunity for Stalin to consolidate power when he assumed a leadership role in the late 1920s. Under his control, he implemented policies aimed at rapidly industrializing the Soviet economy at any cost. This involved enforcing agricultural collectivization and developing heavy industry, intending to transform the nation from an agricultural society into an industrial powerhouse. Consequently, the country experienced notable economic growth and modernization. However, this approach had severe human costs, with millions forcibly relocated to collective farms, resulting in famines and other disasters due to disrupted traditional agricultural practices. The push for heavy industry also led to poor working conditions and disregard for worker safety, leading to numerous accidents and deaths. Stalin's regime was characterized by brutal repression, involving the execution and imprisonment of countless political opponents and intellectuals through mass purges conducted by the notorious NKVD, Soviet secret police. Censorship and propaganda measures were put in place to maintain the regime's control over information flow. Once the economy was growing and domestic dissent was under control, Stalin shifted his focus to expanding the Soviet Empire. However, it is important to clarify a mistake made in a previous video, where the Soviets were referred to as the good guys in World War II. In reality, the Soviets were aggressors, signing a secret pact with Nazi Germany not to oppose their invasion of Poland and dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. After signing the agreement, the Soviet Union annexed parts of Poland and Romania. They also attempted to conquer Finland during the Winter War, resulting in the annexation of Finnish territory. However, Hitler saw the Soviet Union as a potential target for expansion, leading to the surprise attack known as Operation Barbarossa in 1941. This forced Stalin to join the Allies and fight against Germany. The Soviet Union played a crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany and occupied significant portions of Eastern Europe, installing communist governments in these regions, seen as satellite states. These governments were characterized by political repression, censorship, and the suppression of dissent. The annexation of certain territories contributed to the division of Europe into opposing blocs, the Western democracies, and the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. Similarly to the historical trajectory of Russia, the Soviet Union was also a union of various regions and people with diverse cultures, languages, and beliefs. However, this diversity also made it vulnerable to the emergence of breakaway states. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union pursued a socialist economic system based on state ownership and central planning, with a heavy emphasis on military spending and heavy industry. While the Soviet economy initially grew rapidly after World War II, it eventually slowed down due to a lack of investment in new technology and the limitations of a centralized planning system. The economy heavily relied on exports of oil, gas, and other natural resources, leading to instability due to fluctuations in global commodity prices and international demand. Additionally, the centralized decision-making process hindered the diversification of the economy, making it inefficient in meeting the needs of its citizens. You have an excess of cereal production but a scarcity of bread, a somewhat simplistic example, but it underscores the issue. Imagine this predicament extending throughout the entire economy. You can comprehend the magnitude of the problem. Please consider hitting the like button if you haven't already. Now, back to the topic at hand. Besides these difficulties, the Soviet Union faced economic sanctions and embargoes from the West, which further strained its economy. The most apparent consequence of these economic challenges was the scarcity of essential goods like food, clothing, and household items. Queues for basic necessities were common, and people had to resort to the black market to obtain vital items. The overall quality of life for citizens deteriorated, with cramped and inadequate housing, underfunded public services, including healthcare and education. Despite emphasizing equality, many workers had low wages and limited prospects for advancement. The absence of incentives for improved efficiency or reduced waste contributed to low productivity and unfavorable working conditions. Then, in the 1980s, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced perestroika, a series of economic reforms aimed at modernizing the Soviet economy, fostering innovation, and increasing efficiency. Perestroika encompassed various areas, including agriculture, industry, and foreign trade, with a key aspect being the decentralization of economic decision-making. The goal was to provide enterprises greater autonomy to encourage innovation and efficiency. The reforms also promoted market-oriented changes, allowing limited private enterprise, establishing a stock market, and welcoming foreign investment. The hope was that these reforms would invigorate the Soviet economy. Additionally, perestroika aimed to foster openness and transparency in government and economic matters, including the relaxation of censorship and encouraging public debate on economic and political issues. The reforms lacked clear direction and failed to address fundamental problems within the Soviet economy. During this time, Russia engaged in the war in Afghanistan, which further diverted resources from domestic economic improvement. The Afghan war turned into a quagmire, adding to the disintegration of the Soviet Union by the late 1980s. It resulted in tens of thousands of Soviet losses and inflicted considerable damage on Afghanistan and the Soviet Union's economy and national prestige. Ultimately, perestroika failed to modernize the Soviet economy and tackle the deep-rooted issues stemming from decades of central planning and bureaucratic inefficiencies. Economic inequality persisted, with privileged treatment for officials and party members, while many workers struggled with meager wages and limited opportunities. This situation eroded confidence in the government's ability to manage the economy and meet the needs of its citizens. This, in turn, contributed to a more extensive disillusionment with the Soviet system and the government's capacity to fulfill its promises. At this point, the USSR had become one of the world's largest nations, occupying nearly 1/6 of the Earth's landmass and comprised of 15 republics: Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. However, cracks were now evident. The stark contrast between the opulence of the elites and the poverty faced by ordinary Soviet citizens fueled a backlash among the younger generation, who rejected Communist Party ideology their parents had embraced. Despite Gorbachev's efforts at reform, the results were slow to materialize and instead hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union. As controls loosened, independence movements in Eastern European satellite states gained momentum, with political revolutions in Poland in 1989, setting off peaceful revolutions across the region, leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall. Consequently, on December 25th, Gorbachev resigned as the leader of the USSR, and on December 31st, 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. All 15 republics we previously discussed became independent states, and the Soviets lost control of territories in Finland, Poland, and Romania. The collapse also resulted in a sharp decline in industrial output and a rise in unemployment. In 1991 alone, the GDP plummeted by about 1.6, and the budget deficit amounted to approximately 1/4 of the GDP, leading to rampant hyperinflation and the collapse of the local currency in the newly formed Russia. This economic downturn is often considered worse than the 1930s Great Depression experienced in the United States. Amidst these developments, Chechnya attempted to gain independence from Russia, where Putin employed brutal tactics to suppress the revolution. After a swift privatization effort that produced numerous oligarchs, Russia appeared to be progressing towards democracy and a market economy. However, a significant shift occurred with Putin's rise to power in the late 1990s as prime minister, followed by his presidency in the early 2000s. Putin's perspective on the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century provides insight into his ambitions. It becomes evident through his actions that Putin aims to reassemble the Soviet Union. Political dissent is met with punishment, such as poisonings and imprisonment, as seen with Navalny. Putin has also employed military forces to support regions from former Soviet states in their military conflicts, exemplified in the cases of Georgia in 2008 and Crimea in 2014. Presently, Russia, like the Soviet Union, is a federal state with 83 republics and regions under Kremlin's control. Spanning across 11 time zones, Russia has a significant portion of its population belonging to various local indigenous nations. The quest for expansion continues, despite facing struggles in its domestic economy. Russia is now embroiled in a war, draining resources and manpower, while facing the challenge of keeping up with supplies from the West in the midst of stringent global sanctions. The situation poses a potential disaster, with casualties mounting and no end in sight for Putin's messianic revanchism. Putin's targeted conscription of specific nationalities like Sakha Tatars and Chechens has sparked a demand for autonomy. Unlike before, the Kremlin's resources are depleting, and Western governments are more resolute in opposing Russia's brutality. Russia's history shows that its leaders have historically employed both rewards and punishments to keep the country's far-flung regions united. However, the current situation suggests that the eventual dissolution of the Russian Federation can no longer be dismissed. Tsars employed a dual approach towards conquered nations, granting cultural autonomy to some while forcibly assimilating others. Similarly, the Soviet regime adopted a similar playbook, at times celebrating national identities, and at others resorting to deportation and punishment for those deemed unfaithful to their ideals. Under Putin's rule, socioeconomic disparities have grown between residents of affluent metropolitan centers and those in poorer provincial regions, leading to tensions. The war in Ukraine has intensified calls for greater autonomy for Moscow, generating backlash in regions with significant ethnic minority populations that have already faced high casualty rates during conscription. Presently, Russia's political, economic, and social instability may eventually compel its constituent units to seek independence, especially if Russia withdraws from the war in a manner that damages its prestige, similar to the events following its withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989. To prevent public unrest, the Kremlin fears any signs of dissent, as protests can quickly escalate, particularly during economic downturns caused by Putin's war. Local politicians in remote regions may find more public support than Putin, creating challenges for the Kremlin. In Moscow, Russia's political stability hinges on the support of the elites. However, power struggles among rival elites and oligarchs during times of uncertainty can exacerbate unrest throughout the country. The current Wagner Group leaders poll, questioning support for Putin as president, highlights that elitist loyalty is motivated by economic and political benefits rather than ideology. The faltering war with Ukraine, which has exposed Putin's weaknesses and those of his state, could act as the spark that ignites the already frayed timbers of Russian institutions. Sparks prove capricious, and Russia may endure the ongoing crisis under Putin or a successor, but it will inevitably suffer substantial weakening, with all underlying tensions persisting. In his 2023 New Year's address, Putin even hinted at the potential threat to Russian independence due to war, an unprecedented statement. Should Russia collapse, the most critical concern would be the handling of its nuclear arsenal, a matter of grave significance for nations like the EU, USA, and China, as they fear the weapons falling into dangerous hands. However, the collapse of the USSR serves as a reminder that external powers like the USA and the West played a minor role. Structural forces were the primary cause. The uncertain fate of Russia's nuclear arsenal will drive all efforts to prevent a catastrophic event. Nevertheless, superpowers like China and the USA may differ on other issues. China heavily relies on Russia as a key supplier of energy for its rapid economic growth, and a Russian collapse might disrupt oil and gas flows, leading to shortages and increased prices, impacting China and global energy markets. Concerns arise over the potential for instability, conflict, separatist movements, ethnic tensions, and transnational crime and terrorism in the region following Russia's collapse. China would closely watch the actions of the USA, which may seek to fill the power vacuum by enhancing its influence and promoting reforms to further democracy and human rights in Russia. On the flip side, the United States might have concerns regarding potential instability and conflict in the region if Russia collapses, leading to a power vacuum that could trigger heightened competition among countries like China and European nations for regional influence. This competition could escalate tensions and conflicts, posing a threat to U.S. interests in the area. European countries, closely tied to Russia in terms of energy and trade, would also face economic disruptions and potential losses in the event of a Russian collapse. They may worry about regional instability, breakdowns in law and order, and mass refugee movements. Thank you for watching the video. Please like, subscribe, and enable notifications.